first of all, I would like, before I'm starting to ask you several professional specific questions, let me remind you one very symbolic event, as to me, which occurred in 2014 when the World Congress of Accountants has happened in Rome. I saw you there for the first time. You were one of the main chairs of that influential event. And the last day, exactly at 9 o'clock a.m., as I remember, you appeared on the stage of that beautiful Auditorium Parco della Musica with a raincoat.
Yes,
remember that?
Remember. I remember.
Yes, it was a very symbolic joke from your part, because the night before, we, the 4,000 delegates of this Congress, had a heavy night, a very heavy night. We went on a social event in Cinecittà, the famous Italian film studio, and suddenly a very heavy rain and a thunderstorm started, and we all the CPAs were in a very frightened. So as I remember, in a raincoat, you started with the words, "This is life, this is our profession, storms, sudden lightning, challenges, difficulties, but we are strong and we can handle with all of these challenges." And I couldn't forget that moment. So I'm really extremely happy and touched to be here and to have the possibility to see you again and to ask you several questions. I would like to ask you now, 8 years later, what kind of clothes or accessories, maybe armor, maybe pink glasses, maybe black glasses, does one modern auditor or accountant need today, now? What is your opinion, Mr. Silf?
Well, thank you for that introduction. And just let me start by, I will answer your question, but let me start by thanking the Varna University of Economics and the Bulgarian CPAs for inviting me to be part of this discussion and this forum. I am only sorry that I cannot be there in person and to shake your hands again, because you are right. We had an interesting discussion in 2014 about the future of accountancy. And what clothes would I be wearing today? That's a great question. I do not feel armor is necessary. I feel that the future for our profession is immense, enormous. We are going to be needed by business and governments more than ever before. It's an exciting time. I wish I was starting my time in the profession instead of almost finishing my time in the profession. I think the next 10 to 20 years will be exciting, challenging. And for those of us who've been in practice for many years, different. We are going to have to learn new things, different things, and be prepared to answer to new challenges. But I'm confident that accountants around the world are well equipped to face change and accept challenges. And I think the only challenge will be for those accountants around the world and those auditors around the world who will not accept change. For them, life will be a challenge. But for the rest of us, bring it on. It's going to be fun.
Okay, I firmly agree with you. My first question is, do you have the feeling of a continuous increasing over complication of the meta code RFRS? Does this actually add value to the business and broadly to the society, or does it somewhat serve to any interest? This is my first question to you, Mr. Silf.
There is no doubt that accounting is getting more complicated, but then so is business getting more complicated, and business is getting more and more international. Companies on the publicly listed markets have investors from all over the world, and so the underlying principle of there being a common set of accounting standards that is used everywhere is very, very important. Is it too complicated? Well, there are as many smart people, whether they be professional accountants or people from universities or other backgrounds, who are operating as chief financial officers or finance directors of companies, who are looking for innovative ways to create value in their businesses. And as they come up with new ideas on how to account for transactions or to report transactions, so I think the IFRS needs to be prepared to provide guidance on how those new accounting ideas should be recognized and reported on a consistent basis around the world. Does that make them too complicated for the average company, the not public company, the SME? Yes, I think it does. I think we have got a set of accounting standards that work well, but with some difficulty for public listed entities and for the investors in public listed entities. But we need to be quite aware that those accounting standards are probably too complicated, too complex, and address too many issues that are not relevant for the SME marketplace. But I think it's important to remember that the International Accounting Standards Board in London has been recognizing this and have developed an alternative set of accounting standards, the IFRS for SMEs, which is exactly meant to be a bridging solution to provide good accounting for SME companies without having the complexity involved in the full set of IFRS for publicly listed entities. Is it still too complicated? Some people say yes, some people say no. Accounting standards cannot possibly imagine every specific situation that will exist. So they are obviously written at a level that requires some professional judgment. When you have professional judgment, you can have differences of opinion. And that's the nature of accounting. We are a group of people around the world who use very well developed brains to think about the reality of what a transaction looks like, and therefore what's the right way to record it, and ultimately what's the right way to audit it.
Do you think that the RFRS give too much freedom for professional judgment and assessment in applying them to the management of the company, taking into account that the different management staff has different level of competence? And how does it influence the quality of information in the financial statements, including its qualitative characteristics like relevance, comparability, and usefulness for the users of information? Just in brackets, many people in the management of the typical Bulgarian companies are not so well educated in accounting, and this makes a big trouble for auditors and for the preparers of financial statements, because the management doesn't understand the philosophy, the meaning of RFRS. And this is a problem. What do you think about it?
I don't think that management of companies in Bulgaria are any more different than managers of companies in many other countries around the world. I think your assessment is quite correct, that management do not understand the accounting standards, whether it's IFRS or IFRS for small and medium enterprises. and they have to ask their accountants for help. That's a global challenge. It's exactly the same everywhere in the world, from the United States to the United Kingdom to Bulgaria. The same set of challenges exist. But you're asking, I think, are the standards allowing for too much professional judgment, and should the standards be more specific in exactly defining how transactions should be accounted? The only thing I can observe is when I started, we had a lease accounting standard that was very specific about how do you account for leases. Are they operating leases or are they capital leases? And the accounting standards then specified exactly what percentage of calculation would force the preparer to record the lease as either a capital lease or an operating lease. So what did smart leasing companies do? The leasing companies structured the deal to allow the entity to meet the requirements for operating leases, not capital leases. So as soon as you had a fixed percentage described in an accounting standard as the requirement of whether the residual value is 10% or more of the fair value, then smart leasing companies would devise and design their leasing options to be able to tell their clients, you can write off all of the expense as an expense in every year because this would be regarded as an operating lease. But in reality, it wasn't. It's a capital lease. But because the standards were so specific, so rigorous in how you measured whether something was a capital lease or an operating lease, people got around the concept of what was really fair presentation, what was really happening in this transaction, and managed to live with writing off all of the expenses of an asset that at the end of the day became the asset of the company. I'm just using one example to try and argue that the need for judgment as to what is really the substance of a transaction in a particular situation for a particular company does require judgment. What was management thinking when they entered into this transaction? What was their objective? And that does mean that management and therefore accountants and then auditors have to use their professional judgment to decide whether accounting option 1 or accounting option 2 is the right choice. But I think that's better, much better, than a set of very specific rules, which obviously make it easy for management and the preparing accountant and then the auditor to follow and say, we meet the rule, therefore we do it this way. But I think it loses something in the objective of saying, what's the intent of the transaction, and therefore what's fair presentation for a particular company in a particular set of circumstances. So even though everybody's professional judgment is different, and even though my own professional judgment when I was 21 has changed between that age and the age that I am today, based on life, based on experience, based on past mistakes, I think it's better to be using professional judgment than it is to have a set of such defined rules. Because if the rules are so specific, then people will find a way of finding a reason why this transaction doesn't fit this set of specific rules. And therefore, I can do my own thing anyway, because this doesn't fit the rules as written by the IASB or whichever other accounting standard body you're following.
I see, but it's very difficult as to me to train and to educate people, the future accountants or auditors, to develop professional judgment. This is the problem here in Bulgaria. I firmly agree with you that, of course, it's better to use professional judgment than to go to some very specific rules and to try to go under the rules. But this is the problem here in Bulgaria. From my professional experience, most of the auditors and accountants wants to know what's the rule. I just want to follow the rule. I don't want to think. I don't want to create any professional judgment. This is the problem. And maybe to have a very solid professional judgment, as you said, this is a process of development of professional experience over the years.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Strict rules does not make a profession. A profession, whether it's accounting or any other profession, requires the use of professional judgment inside a framework of rules. So if you think about a doctor has got rules on how you perform a surgery. There are manuals, very clear, but you have to use your experience. When you open somebody up on the operating table, you see something that you weren't expecting. And you can't say, oh, I'm not going to ignore that, or I'm going to stitch the person up and forget I ever opened the person in the first place. That won't work. You have to use your judgment and your experience to decide how you deal with the circumstances that you're looking at. I don't think your description is any different from what would happen in a university in most other countries of the world, particularly as a university student. People tend to want to have the answer. If I learn the answer, I will pass the exam. I will become a doctor. I will become an accounting professional. But the reality is that if all we had to do was follow the rules, we wouldn't have to go through so many years of training and studying, because you can teach rules much more quickly than you can teach judgment. Let me give you an example of judgment. I remember when I was a young accountant, I had been graduated about 3 years, maybe 4 years, and I was doing an audit, and I gave it a clean opinion. And then I went back the next year for the next year's audit, and in that second year, I found a fraud. And I realized that the fraud had existed last year as well. I had missed the fraud the first time that I was doing the audit, but I found it the second time. Has that changed my judgment on every audit I have done ever since then? Yes. Ever since then, no matter what the standard audit programs say, in the back of my mind, there is something about how the directors of that company fooled me. And my judgment on how I'm doing an audit is impacted by that experience. You can't always teach that. You can teach people to apply judgment. You can give them all sorts of case studies that will give them examples of, here is a situation, what would you do? But when you are at a certain age, your answer will be different from what it will be 20 years later. The important thing, I think, is that as professional accountants and auditors, we have to understand the nature of judgment, which means literally sitting back when we get a series of facts or a set of draft financial statements and saying, does this make sense? Am I looking at something that makes sense? Or, given my judgment of having looked at 10 audits this year, 25 audits this year, 125 audits in my lifetime, that it doesn't make sense. Now, a good example would be the impact on COVID on audits. So you've been doing audits one way for many years, then we get COVID, and we are all struggling with changing the way we do audits because we can't do them quite the same way that we did before. And what do you do in professional judgment? You bring your experience of the last audit you did, where the client was impacted by COVID, and you say to yourself, how does that impact the audit I'm looking at today? And if it was, let's say you were auditing a restaurant in a town where there had been COVID and there had been lockdowns, and therefore the restaurant had had no customers, only people who were going to pick up food at the front door, but not come down to sit at a table. Well, the experience that you had in your last audit should force you to think about COVID and the impact on this audit and the next audit and the one after that. That's applying professional judgment. If they tell me that revenues have not changed since last year, does that make sense? No. If you're a restaurant, I'm sure that your revenues went down from the pre-COVID year to the current COVID year. So you're applying professional judgment and thinking about how all of that impacts the facts and circumstances that you're looking at.
Professional judgment has to be based on philosophy, on a holistic approach to the business of a company. What's your opinion according to the voluntary application of international financial reporting standards and the possible switch to national accounting standards and vice versa? I don't want to go to any details concerning Bulgarian legislation in this field, but the main question is it, do you agree, what is your opinion, is it useful a company which is not a public company, which is not in a group, to follow IFRS voluntarily in its individual financial statement? Does it make any sense for the users of information?
Well, I think the first answer is consistency. Whoever is going to use the financial statements of the company should be getting a consistent reporting package. I think the idea of being able to say, this year I use IFRS, next year I'm going to use national accounting standards, then the next year I might change back and use IFRS, is very bad. That's not helpful. What is helpful is consistent reporting. Should companies who are not required to follow IFRS choose to follow IFRS? Well, again, I think it's a question of a series of judgments that management must make. And the judgments follow around these questions. First of all, are the national accounting standards that are my second choice close to IFRS or very, very different from IFRS? And if they are very, very different, then which set of financial reporting provides the people that are using my financial statements with the best information? And I think management has to look at this from the point of view of the users of financial statements, not management's own choice. Which format would provide the best, most information to users? Now, who are users? If users are the management team, because it's a privately held and operated company, then management and the users are the same people. If the users are lenders, banks, financial institutions, that's different. If the users are unions who are worried about their workers employed by the company and need to understand what the position of the company is and need to understand what they might be able to use as information in negotiation for labor contracts, then that's a different group of users. And I think management have to put themselves in the position of saying, is it acceptable to use a simpler set of accounting standards, maybe a national set of standards? Is it better to use IFRS for SMEs, which is a good set of accounting standards, comprehensive and able to be used globally and is used globally? Or is it better to use full IFRS? Can they look at financial reports from this year and last year and the year before and make a true assessment of how the business has moved? And the same for users, whoever that user group is. It's very confusing, I think, for a company to go backwards and forwards between one set of accounting standards and another. What is the long-term objective? If it's a private company with the long-term objective of becoming a public company, a listed entity, then you can't wait until the year before you want to be listed and convert from national accounting standards to international standards. You need to have preparation. You need to be thinking along the lines of, what is it I'm going to present to potential investors if I go public? And I need to be able, as management, I need to know that the statements I'm going to present make sense. And I'd be very upset if I had been preparing them in accordance with a set of national accounting standards, and suddenly in 1 year I have to move to IFRS. That's complicated. That's a lot of work in 1 year, in the year that you're trying to go public. So I would try and suggest that consistency of presentation is the most important thing, and a good understanding of what the users require helps you decide which is the right accounting framework that you should follow, but not changing backwards and forwards. That doesn't make, in my mind, that makes no sense.